Hello, good evening, and welcome to part 3 of our community conversation on marginalized and underserved groups in Jamestown, New York. I'm WRFA Station Manager Jason Sample. We're broadcasting live tonight, once again, from the Regilene Center for the Arts Media Arts Studio. Tonight is the third installment in a 3-part panel discussion intended to raise public awareness of specific groups in Jamestown and the challenges they face, both past and present. It will also work to identify solutions to overcoming these challenges in order to bring more inclusiveness, diversity, equity, and accessibility to our community. Each panel discussion will feature representatives from 5 community groups, including the local African American community, the Hispanic community, the LGBTQ+ community, those affected by chemical dependency, and those impacted by generational poverty. In the first 2 installments of our series, we took an historical perspective on the groups and also focused on the present state of each group, highlighting their contemporary challenges, hurdles, and obstacles. Tonight, we'll discuss what changes are required at both the local and state level, and perhaps elsewhere, from the prospective panelist point of view, in order to bring about more diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility for our fellow community members. I'll remind our in-studio audience that they are welcome to write down questions and hand them to our Director of Hospitality, Heather Felton. Meanwhile, our online audience is welcome to write questions in the comment field on both Facebook and YouTube, and I'll share them with our moderators as they come in. Please keep your questions brief and to the point. Our program is made possible thanks to an action grant from Humanities New York and funding from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting's American Rescue Plan Stabilization Grant. It's also presented by Regilene Center for the Arts, the license holder of WRFA Radio, and the Labyrinth Press Company is assisting with hospitality. I'd also like to note that we hope this 3-week series of panel discussions serves as a springboard for other panel discussions in 2022, and which focuses on other underserved and marginalized groups not represented in this community conversation that has unfolded the past 3 weeks. Also worth noting that in addition to being broadcast on WRFA airwaves, our program is being video streamed by Kip Reynolds at Cranky Plate Productions on both YouTube and Facebook. Our audio engineer is Regilene Technical Director Owen Murphy. Let's introduce our moderators for tonight. Julia Cecila Hanley has been the Public Affairs Director at WRFA since April 2021. More recently employed by the City of Jamestown's Recreation Department as the Recreation Coordinator for 12 years. Ms. Cecila Hanley previously served on WRFA's Community Advisory Board and is a volunteer since the station's inception back in 2004. Amit Taneja served as the inaugural Senior Vice President and Chief IDEA Officer, which stands for Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility, at Chautauqua Institution. He started in this role in May 2021. He has over 2 decades of experience doing IDEA work in higher education, and most recently served as Associate Provost at the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. He has also worked at Hamilton College, Syracuse University, Bowling Green State University, and the University of British Columbia. I'll now hand it over to our 2 moderators. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jason. I'm Amit Taneja. I use he, him pronouns. So we'll start by doing a little bit of level setting and taking a look back at the last 2 weeks. We really focused in the first week on talking about the histories of the various communities represented here today. And the last week, the second session, was really taking a look at the present circumstances that are impacting the communities represented today. So today's conversation will be more future-facing, looking at solutions and ways in which different communities can work together and move forward. So that's kind of our goal today. We are very excited that these conversations are generating not only the dialogue here, but also the dialogue outside in the community, and we're very hopeful that this is also creating a historical archive for this very important conversation. For those of you who may have missed the previous 2 panels, please know that you can see the full version available, which are both available online at WRFALP.com or the WRFA YouTube channel. With that, I'll turn it over to my co-moderator, Julia.
Hi. I'm Julia Cecila Hanley. Again, my pronouns are she, hers, and I'm going to introduce you to our panel of guests today. Starting on my far right, we have Tamu Graham Reinhardt. Her pronouns are she, her. She is a Jamestown City Council member at large, as well as a administrator for the Jamestown School District, and she is here representing the African American community. Next to her, we have Emily Van Way. Her pronouns are she, her. She is the LGBTQ liaison for Prevention Works, and she also is a steering committee member of Jamestown Pride. She will be here representing the LGBTQ plus community. Salomar Vasquez, pronouns are she, her. She works for the county executive of Chautauqua County. She also is a medical interpreter, and she is here representing the Hispanic community. Over here on to my left, we have Emma Fabian. Pronouns are she, her. She is the Associate Vice President of Harm Reduction for the Evergreen Health Services. She will be representing those dealing with chemical dependency in that community. And also Josiah Lamp. Pronouns are he, his, and he is the Director of Housing and Community Development for Chautauqua Opportunities, and he will be speaking about those impacted by generational poverty. And I'll leave it over to Amit to ask the first question.
Great. So, as I said, we've taken a look back at the present circumstances, but those present circumstances also help us think about the challenges for the future. So the first question for our panelists is really about what are the main issues that your communities and their leadership would like to work on or continue working on for the future. And we'll start with Temu as the first respondent.
Okay, thank you. That's such a big question. Because I think people need to understand it. We need to set the tone for the fact that while I'm here talking on behalf of the African American community, I don't represent the whole community. And so I think people need to be mindful of the fact that just because someone may belong to a certain community, they're not representative or speaking for that group. So just want to set the tone there. But policies at the federal, state, and local level, when you think about the government, are complicated and complex. When you think about housing policies, you think about law enforcement policies, you think about all of the things that the government does to kind of regulate our lives. And what I am finding, and what I think people would appreciate, is when policy is written, that you have people at the table who from a variety of different backgrounds. And so when we start talking about changes in law enforcement, when we did the law enforcement reinvention plan, we engaged all of the communities because we wanted to really see how the policies and procedures of the Jamestown Police Department affected marginalized communities. And so we really wanted to make sure that their experiences and their background and their viewpoint were validated. And I think oftentimes policies are made by, the term I often use is, we have dominant and non-dominant cultures. And so dominant cultures usually write the policies, and the people that benefit most from the policies are the people who kind of control the dominant culture. And without really thinking about how marginalized communities might be impacted by something they think at this level might be great, but when it comes to trickling down, it becomes much more difficult for people to engage in. I've also seen where over the years, policies have been changed. However, practices, so there's difference between policies and practices, right? Policies are things that are on the books that you can say, this is our policy and this is what we do. But you also have those practices and unwritten practices that still exist that may, that are not definitely not in the policies. For example, the practice of redlining, when you talk about the Fair Housing Act, still continues to this day in various places to keep certain communities away from other communities, right? So it's not a policy on the book, but there have been practices that where the policies have tried to close the loopholes as we become more advanced and as we start to do more research, the practices that people bring with them or the practices that have always been ingrained haven't changed. And so it's kind of if you're going to adopt a policy, you have to change the practice as well. So I would say in areas of education and equity, I think many people from the African American community feel as though their children aren't being educated as well, even though we have national policies and laws and all of those things where all children are supposed to get X, Y, Z. We aren't seeing that at the grassroots level. And so the African American community is asking, so why is that? And why aren't we being asked what we need? So that's, I think, what I would say about that. And I think it's also, it's hard to get access. it's hard to get access to the resources that you need if you don't know the policy and you don't know how to navigate the systems. And you don't have somebody in there to help you navigate the system, and don't talk to this person, you do this first, do that, then there's a disconnect. And so you can say, well, our policy